6 years. It's almost been 6 years since that glorious time where the world decided to stop, where we were shuttered in place and some of us had to pivot. I, for one, decided to convert my garage into a little workshop. The thought was, given that restaurants are closed, most people are going to be cooking at home and also investing into their space. So why not make cutting boards? In my last video, I mentioned how I thought that cutting boards was a gateway into woodworking. So I figured, why not go back to the roots and build a couple boards? Just starting out, I turned to Instagram and YouTube for both inspiration and tutoring. Needless to say that my first couple boards were lightly knockoffs at best. And in time, I was able to find my own unique direction. This brings up a topic that looms over the creative world. Inspiration versus impersonation. Imitation, recreation, copying, forgery. If we look around the world, there's a lot of the same yet different. Just look at how many different makes and models of cars there are. It's still just a car. Even you are a byproduct of forgery. Believe it or not, your parents didn't innovate the art of round peg, round hole that conceived the person that you see in the mirror every day. Which brings us to Josh. I discovered Josh's work back in 2020 when I was doom scrolling for inspiration and stumbled across this little dime of a board. The colors and patterns reminded me of something out of V for Vendetta. Which, side note, doesn't it seem now that that film was more of a colorful documentary than an actual work of fictional art? Anyways, back to Josh. Josh has since moved from the world of cutting boards and has found himself creating custom guitars, which makes me wonder if this little bevel on the corner here was inspired by a Fender Stratocaster. So I reached out to Josh and asked if I could rip off some of his designs to create this video. Incidentally, he himself also has a YouTube channel, so I'm going to leave the link to the YouTube channel along with his Instagram in the comment section, so be sure to check out his channel and his work because he is quite the creator. Okay, back to the video. What I'm doing here is I'm cutting off these 45-degree miters so that I have a 90-degree face to take over to the joiner. And once done at the joiner, I then move over to the miter saw and cut these to length. Which will be 16 inches in length and 12 inches by width. And then back to the table saw to get their final dimensional width. Next is to the drum sander so that I can get those detail stringers to the right thickness. Side note, if you caught my first video, then you already know that I'm currently sitting on a rustic walnut encased in concrete table base that really needs to find a new home. So if you have any interest, please contact me so we can get this baddie where it belongs. With all the milling done, it's now time to just glue it up. No need to even get creative with it, given that I've already spoken to Josh and he's fully comfortable with me stealing his design. However, I'm too far into my woodworking career to be ripping off other people's designs for the sake of a YouTube video, so I'm going to lean into a new direction, which was also inspired by Josh after I found out that he was now building custom guitars. Whenever I do a glue up, I'm always reminded of these words of my high school woodshop teacher, Mr. Lester. He always said, the more the merrier, make sure that it's slicker than snot. Sometimes I wonder what happened to him. I mean, our woodshop class was an absolute circus. I don't think there was a quarter that went by that we weren't sending a kid to the emergency room to reattach a finger or get stitched up. I'll never forget the time that I was nailing up a cabinet with glue-tipped nails and nail gun, and one went straight through and lodged in my finger. Ran over to Mr. Lester and he said, "We're not going to the nurse." He threw my hand in a bench vise, grabbed some vice grips, and pulled that sucker out. With this face grain board being in glue up for the next 24 hours, it's off to the end grain cutting board. That's right, we're doing two. If you're going to steal one design, you might as well steal two. For the end grain cutting board, I'm going with Luke's design from Owl Woodworks. Now, I reached out to Luke, however, what I found is that he is taking a sabbatical from woodworking to focus on raising his son. I mean, how can you argue with that? Reluctantly, I did not get a response back from my message, so I'm going to do it anyway, and then when I go to sell it, I'm actually going to take those proceeds and put it into a savings account, and if he ever hits me back up, that's going to Luke's baby boy. You may be asking yourself, why would anyone take two different people's designs, spend the time to create the boards, make a video, edit that video, narrate that video, just to announce that you stole the designs? And my response to that is hope. I hope that someone out there is watching this video that may be stagnant on creating anything because of the aspect of forgery or that it's already been done. Yet, look at this design by Luke. Talk about just a flawless execution of innovation. Yet did Luke create and invent the cutting board? No. More than likely, he replicated something that he saw, which eventually led him to express his own brilliance that resulted in the masterpieces that he had created. That is to say, that following the outline of another's creative direction may just lead you to your own path, one that's forged through practice and diligence of technique to find your own expression. Alright, back to the board. So I've got to take this 5/4 walnut down to 4/4. And if you're not sure what 5 4/4 means, it's essentially just quarters of an inch. So 4/4 is an inch, 5/4 is 1.25 inches, 8/4 is 2 inches, so on and so forth. I'll be ripping both the Padauk and walnut down to 6 inches, so that way when I marry them, the board's width will be 12 inches total. With the Padauk being 8/4, i.e. 2 inches thick, I don't want to waste all that material by planing off a full inch. So over at the bandsaw, I can resaw it just over an inch thickness. And Once I have that, I can go back to the planer and take it down to my final dimension. With those main pieces out of the way, I can now turn my focus over to ripping my stock to create the 1/8 inch thick stringers that's going to separate the pattern. Now for the stringers, I didn't have the appropriate 36 inches of length to get it in one contiguous piece, so I had to settle on creating 2 separate panels that I'm gluing up together in one big swoop. And given that the thickness of these are going to be less than 1/8 of an inch when it's all said and done, the little variations of indifference you're not even going to see. Now given that I'm a Virgo, and perfectionism is ingrained into my DNA, these seemingly small and insignificant infractions are a practice in just overcoming to allow the process to be what it is. And it's also something to say that not everything needs to be precise, only when it matters. A good friend of mine once said, "We're not building a rocket ship. It's not going to space." The next day, I released these newly bonded soulmates from their Bessie shackles to take steps towards their final form. From here, I did a small cleanup with the chisel and scraper just to remove some of the excess glue that I'd missed while doing the glue up. And then after that, straight back to the planer for surfacing. With the stringers planed to their final thickness, it was time to just do a couple light passes on the larger stock just to get it surfaced properly. The face grain board came out of the glue up with a little bit of a rock, so I turned to my planer sled along with the playing card trick to render a usable reference surface to level. Then it was back to the table saw to get everything in their respective dimensions. As mentioned earlier, after I spoke with Josh about using his design, I got inspired about what he's currently doing with the custom guitars. So instead of this being an actual cutting board, as it is a charcuterie board serving platter, if you will. And as for the end grain cutting board, whereas I can totally do a one-for-one replica of Luke's work, I'm feeling a little pulled to go in a very different direction because I really want to honor what it is that he's already done. That man just has such a different eye and relationship with understanding grain and how it flows and finding the rhythm to the story of the grain. When I first got into carpentry, I really didn't understand the importance of grain structure at all. Which way it went, making sure that it matched, what the grain actually taught you about how to approach it. All of that came through a lot of trial and error. I believe that's one of my favorite things about woodworking is it forces you to learn through the aspect of mistakes. Doesn't matter how far along you are in your career, you're always going to make a mistake. And it's in that moment that you learn, pivot, and forces you to get really creative about how you're going to approach that whoops. You know, there's that saying, measure twice and cut once. Well, I think that I'm with Chris over at Four Eyes Furniture. He says that it's much less about accuracy and more about repeatability. And I agree with that. That and of course the old Navy SEALs mantra, which is slow is smooth and smooth is fast. There is so much truth in that. What can be learned in our hurried pursuit towards patience. I never asked Josh if that little bevel on the side of his board was inspired by a guitar, yet it definitely inspired me. And so in lieu of just a traditional rectangle of a board, I chose to follow that inspiration, steal again from Fender, and create the shape of a Stratocaster. The timeless shape of a Stratocaster has so much curvature in it, besides its iconic profile. It has a forearm contour on the face to rest your strumming arm on, and then it has a tummy cut or a rib cut that's scoped out from the inside, rests against your stomach. Starting with the forearm contour on the face, there are two very specific angles that I need to get right. I'll be using the belt sander to sculpt those out. Then using a jig for the belt sander, I'll be able to fine tune the curvature for the profile. Given that I don't have a room for a spindle sander yet, I'm resorting to my Dremel, and then once I'm done with that, I'll go back to fine tuning with the card scraper and hand sanding. Once I got the overall shape of the belly cut with the angle grinder and a flap disc, I moved over to using the orbital sander and then hand sanding with a flashlight to make sure that all of those curves and the shadows were seamless. I took the initial sanding up to 220 and then did a grain pop to raise the grain. And while all that dried and popped to perfection, I turned my sights over to the end grain cutting board to get working on that. And just a quick once over with the chisel to remove the bulk of the squeeze out before migrating this over to the drum sander. Now, when I got started in woodworking, I didn't have all these fancy tools that made the job so much easier. Instead of a drum sander, I had a belt sander and a DeWalt orbital sander. And at that time, I had never even heard of a drum sander, let alone knew exactly what it could do. Needless to say, as time went on, I started upgrading my arsenal of tools. Things started to really open up in terms of the aspect of possibility of what I could create and the rate at which I can create them. However, with all of the innovative tools that are out there right now, the best tool always is the one you have. And I think that's a really important thing to always fall back on. Because where a domino is absolutely amazing, so is a chisel. And when batteries die and gears lock up, the cogs in your brain will begin to roll over ingenuity to keep you moving forward. And back to the end grain board. Now being surfaced and with a usable edge provided by a poor man's track saw, I can now take it back to the table saw and get its final dimensions squared up. And then some slow, deliberate passes on the miter to get it prepared for the profiling at the router table. And speaking of profiling, most fancy charcuterie boards and cutting boards now have brass feet, rubber feet, some kind of feet. And whereas this face grain board I wouldn't classify as fancy or elegant, it still needs feet. So what better way to do that than pop over to the music store and get some actual Fender tuning knobs. Given that these tuning knobs are rather hollow and they'll be upside down, I'm going to fill them with epoxy so that way when this thing gets clean, there's no water that's getting trapped in there, and eliminate the possibility of mold growth. Most end grain cutting boards will have a chamfer or some other kind of harsh profile so that you can grab them because they're rather big, they're heavy. You never really see a round over on a cutting board, and probably for good reason. So I'm gonna grab my 3/4 inch radius round over and put a massive curve on this. And you're probably wondering, well then how are you gonna grab it? Well, I'm gonna go with Luke's design in terms of the cutout for the plate, but instead of doing a cutout, I'm gonna do textured hand-stippled handle grabs. Okay, so I'm gonna do a small moonwalk walk back on what I said earlier in regards to the best tool is the one that you have. Yeah, anyone that's pursuing cutting boards, specifically, get yourself a Festool Rotex. These things are life-changing. They come in 3 different sizes and they just will cut all of your sanding time in half. Which brings us to not this video's sponsor, yet Festool absolutely supported in more than one way. With all of the major shaping already done, it was now time to focus in on the small detail work. So I turned to 4 different bits for the Dremel and started to get in with some hand carving and stippling for the handles on each end of the board. While doing the round over profile, chose to take it a little bit deeper to create that nice shelf to act as built-in feet, and then went and hogged out the rest of the materials so that way there was 6 individual feet running the length of the board, giving it just a little bit under 1/8 of an inch height. Topping it off with the torch to add just a little more contrast and texture. Nothing left but to blow and vacuum these breezies before sending them to the bath. There's nothing quite like your first cutting board done when you soak it into that mineral oil bath, or you do that quick wipe of it, where it's just voila, the money shot. If you've made it to the end, I really have to thank you. Your support means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment. If you didn't enjoy it, definitely leave a comment. I'm not going to ask you to like or subscribe to this channel. Yet if you enjoyed this content, share it with a friend, and also get out there and try something new. Yet be reminded that creating a one-for-one copy of someone else's work is not only theft of the original creator, you're also stealing from your own potential. And yet, you gotta do you, boo.